Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Illiterate. My name is Evan.
My name is Taylor, and I read a book.
I watched a TV show. This week we're doing The Plot Against America. It's on HBO. And it is helmed by crazy, incredible showrunner David Simon, the mind behind The Wire. I checked out the first episode. Taylor checked out the book. But this whole thing, if you're not aware of it, if you...
Sounds dark.
It's very odd. This is about a different route America could have taken heading into World War II if somebody else had run for president and been elected. This is postulating that what would have happened and what it would have felt like in the homeland if Charles Lindbergh had ran and been elected president of the United States going into World War II.
A name that some people, if you even do recognize it, might just associate with flying across the Atlantic by himself and then having his baby abducted and held for ransom. The Lindbergh baby. We don't know
big
much
things.
about him. Yeah,
that's what I grew up as a child learning about. He's kind of this American hero, crazy feats, beloved by many. He's just a huge celebrity, and then he had this horrible tragedy with his baby later in life. But past that, I really didn't know that much. And so when I heard that this was the idea behind the series, I went, oh. Interesting. So we're saying that if somehow America went down a Nazi sympathizer type of route, interesting. Okay, so I started watching the show, and it really starts presenting Lindbergh.
He's an anti-Semitist.
Yeah, I'll just get it right out there as an anti-Semite, which was a bit shocking. And I'm like, wow, it's not even subtle here that it's. And I started asking questions, and immediately I had to stop the show with Emily. And I went, really? Did he say these things? Because it's a lot to take
slanderous.
Exactly. It's a lot to take such a beloved, American quote unquote hero, and then to postulate perhaps these were the views he held at the time, his political views, which I was never aware of. I've never had a reason to look into Charles Lindbergh. So it's a big thought experiment to think about how close we come even to going down the wrong paths.
So hopefully if as we talk about the series and the book and history and whatnot, you'll get a better taste in a sobering and hopeful look at if these are trying times. The good thing to know is that these have happened before, or they could happen a very different way than they did.
Yeah.
So this book, The Plot Against America, came out in 2004. And like you said, the premise of it is that FDR is defeated in the 1940 presidential election by Charles Lindbergh and then becomes the president of the United States, and anti-Semitism is spread under his rule because he has formed an alliance with Hitler, and World War II essentially doesn't happen until Japan bombs Pearl Harbor and FDR gets back in as president in this novel. That's what happens.
Gotcha.
But it's like you said, it's based on these isolationist ideas spread by Lindbergh in real life in this committee called the America First Committee, which we'll get into the history of things. But that's a real thing that he was giving speeches on in real life. The big thing in regards to the show versus the book that people probably are talking about that isn't true is the series came out a couple weeks ago. The book came out in 2004. So whatever our geopolitical climate is with various leaders of state across the world has nothing to do with what this guy was writing about 16 years ago. If anything, people criticized him for saying it was an allegory to the Bush administration, which he also said, no, that's not what I'm writing about. He said all he wanted to do was dramatize what didn't happen in America, but was somebody else's reality, referring to the Jewish people in Europe.
Yeah.
It was like, this is what they went through during World War II, but it could have happened here.
What if it did happen here? That's where this whole thing lies. And it's really interesting. I don't mean to jump the gun, but the series centers really around one family.
Yeah. No, that's not jumping the gun at all, because this in the book, it's narrated by this 7-year-old boy who is named Philip Roth, who is the author.
Good Lord.
It's like literally him. It's almost an autobiographical account as if he had lived through, because he was 7 years old in 1940. This is his family. He uses all the same names of his family members, his mom, his dad, the jobs they had, his brother, all that stuff is exactly what his life was like. It centers on this family in New Jersey
if the ideals of a prejudice had really started to take hold here in America with
Yeah.
a political foothold.
And the difference between this and what some might perceive as other dystopian works or these allegories for mass crazy governmental chaos going on, it's just a slight deviation that has implications. So he said in an interview where they were talking about what are your influences, he was like, I know 1984, I read it a long time ago, like he said Orwell imagined a huge change in the future with horrendous consequences for everyone. Quote, I tried to imagine a small change in the past with horrendous consequences for a relative few.
Right. This is a particularly astute device that he has here, because living in a politically tumultuous time, I'm set right there in the middle of this family, listening to a speech by a man saying things that just are crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It was really fascinating to see as they went into each of the family members of this household.
Mm-hmm.
It was a bit of a slow episode, but just giving you a good amount of time to sit with each person to see what they were about. And through that, you got to see all of their weaknesses and how the political atmosphere at this time would affect the mentalities of every person in the household. By the end of the first episode, you're, as the audience member, know, wow, Lindbergh cannot be president. Though one of the main characters, one of the main boys, is hiding drawings of Lindbergh. He's an artist, and he's drawing life drawings all over the place, and he's getting up in the middle of the night to finish a portrait of Lindbergh outside the Spirit of St. Louis because he's an American hero. He's
Captain America.
He is. He's the closest thing to a hero at this time, 100%. So as a father, what do I do about my son aligning with somebody who really who could hate him?
Mm-hmm.
That right there is a particularly interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
But then that type of dynamic follows every character in this household. And that shows you the array, the depth of which this really is drudging up real conflict and real paranoia of just not knowing where people stand, even within your own home.
Which is such I guess more of a modern way to take it, like the boots on the ground. How is it affecting the every person in the situation, as opposed to the grand sci-fi alternate reality, Hitler wins, all that kind of stuff. This is just like, no, we got a different president and some different things were enacted. And what would that do to a family?
It's a scary thought to think, well, if you take what's maybe the political unrest of the country right now and place it, and I know that's not what he's doing, but that is just the genius of all of this, because it is tapping into the reality that is so close to us. What he's writing about almost could have happened for real.
And in an interview, they had asked him, like, is this a tragedy? What do you make of this as an author? And ultimately, he's like, well, I think it's hopeful in the sense that, like, this didn't happen. It could have. There is a history, which I wrote, where this thing could have happened on American soil, and it did not. And so there's something to be said for that.
100%.
But it's also to look and see, like, well, how close was it, and why didn't it happen? And if Charles Lindbergh had just said, I'm going to run for president, maybe people would have voted for him.
Really. I mean, it becomes a really, really fascinating, interesting thought experiment.
Yeah.
This is the type of thing that, I mean, like I said, while we're all living our lives differently and really starting to rethink some things, this is not a bad way to do it.
So what is this based on in real life then? Let's talk about this America First movement that actually existed.
I had to stop the show because I'm like, you can't just say somebody thought this stuff. Turns out he did. But I just had never heard this, and again, just relating to what's going on today. I mean, it's amazing that people can be touching on and writing about the ideas, the things that, well, they have happened, but we thought we were past. Who knew they were going to happen again? Who knew that a pandemic was going to happen? We thought that 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, probably all of us were thinking it's almost impossible, right?
Well, when smallpox was eradicated, people were like, oh, no more diseases.
Right.
Like, we figured out how to stop diseases. We're done.
Right.
No.
Done. No, it's when you put your weapons down, when you put your guard down, stuff starts seeping back in.
So, and with this historical stuff, I'm not a master historian, so I'm going to gloss over some things and give a broad
take this week to week, people.
Overview. Yeah. We're working hard here. But if you have any extra additional comments, or there's something that's like blatantly erroneous with 5 historical peer-reviewed
Yeah.
sources, please send it to us. But
Please,
in
if
general,
we're wrong, let us know.
this is in general, and I'll post links, as always, in the show notes to where I got all this stuff. America First movement, founded by isolationists in 1940, at its height, 800,000 members
Wow.
in the U.S. We forget, going into, nothing had happened in regards to the U.S. with World War II.
Yeah, that doesn't happen until 1941.
And so, at this point, there is a strong case to be made with these, what is an isolationist viewpoint, to be like, why are we sticking our nose in the rest of the world's problem? Why are we giving money to England to help them? Why, like, what are we doing?
They get into it in
Yeah.
the show. Specifically, I mean, I think this is put from the German pub, is the idea is, if it's Jews being persecuted in Germany, what does that have to do with Americans now?
Yeah.
And so if you're an American Jew, you get it. If you're not, you might take a little bit of just like understanding to get like, oh, there's like crimes against humanity happening. And that maybe somebody ought to stop that. That's at some point in the world, somebody has to say no. At that point, is it the United States' responsibility? I don't know.
Did they
it
get
certainly
did they
become after? But
yeah. Did they get in trouble with a lot of people by being involved in World War I? Yes.
Yes.
Did a mass depression called the Great Depression happen after the 20s, and then somebody got pulled in, FDR, to try and help figure out how to get us out of that mess? Yes. Now we're almost like not quite out of depression. You know, it's been a decade. Things are sort of, and then it's like, oh, the world's at war. Why would we try and, it is a legitimate concern.
So it starts there, but then there are people who don't like Jews. Nazis were a real thing. Anti-Semites are a real thing.
It wasn't just in Germany. It was all over. When you start
going, well, this is not an American problem. Why would we ever? You start attracting people who actually want the persecution of Jews, because that means it's going to continue. That means now the American ideal is not a threat overseas.
Yeah.
That creates a really saturous bed attracting those types of people. So it can start with an idea that on its face totally makes sense. Patriot Act, gotcha. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have implications that attract bad actors in bad faith.
And that's this America First movement had a lot of people. John F. Kennedy donated to it. Walt Disney was a part of it. Sinclair Lewis, Gerald Ford, E.E. Cummings. Like lots of famous people had their finger in the pie in regards to this.
And that doesn't mean
stuff.
that they were anti-Semites.
Yeah.
That means that they were blind enough to not realize what they were sympathizing with.
Some of them were.
Some of them definitely
and
were.
saw what it was being
it's
used,
just hard
turned
to
into.
Say who.
Yeah.
It's hard to say they were an anti-Semite. It becomes, that's where the muddled lives. And that's exactly where the paranoia is dredged out of this story, is not knowing where people's intentions actually lie.
Mm-hmm. And it's not like this was like a thing and like, oh, thank God it didn't happen. Like Evan said, like the U.S. was still very anti-Semitic. The four biggest universities, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Princeton, in terms of prestige, had anti-Semitic policies where they had quotas on the number of Jewish students that could be admitted during this time. Yeah, so it's like God. It is still proliferating everywhere. It's not like, oh, thank God this didn't happen. It still did happen, but not to the degree as
all
it did
the more
in Europe.
saying how close we were. If you got 10% nudge in a different direction, what would have happened? Who would it have emboldened?
Yeah. So to the end of this, it disbanded a few days literally after Pearl Harbor in 1941 because they were like, we got to get into the war effort. Like this idea of we're not involved. Now we are. Too bad.
Yep.
So the whole thing got down. But now where does Charles Lindbergh fit into this whole thing? Why him?
That's weird.
He was the biggest proponent of this and was the major speaker and involver in all this stuff. But Charles Lindbergh as a person, just as a refresher on his whole shtick, May 1927, he's 25 years old, is the first nonstop solo transatlantic flight.
That's pretty awesome.
Became a hero.
Absolutely. Nationally renowned.
Internationally renowned.
Well,
Master of aviation. Was a nobody.
Can you imagine being a
that.
7-year-old at this time? He would be Captain America.
Yeah.
For real.
Bolstering aviation. Planes had not nearly to the degree of what he is saying they're capable of, or what the human, 33 and a half hours alone across the Atlantic. Sometimes he was 10,000 feet up. Sometimes he was 10 feet above the
Oh my
water.
God.
Like it was a harrowing experience, but he got
my
it done.
God.
So now he's a hero. I get confused about this kind of stuff because you learn about it. Amelia Earhart was the first woman to do this.
Right.
She did the same thing a little bit further north in the Atlantic, and that was in 1932.
Okay.
She, though, just in a weird twist of events for modern times, was a nurse in Toronto during the 1918 flu pandemic, and she got what they call the Spanish flu in 1918.
Really?
In Toronto. So it's like you hear about all these people fighting on the front lines and whatever. She was involved in that.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible.
In the parallel to what we're going through now, most recently.
I'm still like, are we gonna find it? We're gonna find the plane one day. One day, or it's out there somewhere, right?
Somewhere in the Pacific.
Somewhere, out there somewhere, Amelia.
But anyways, back to Charles Lindbergh. In 1929, he marries Anne Morrow, the daughter of a famous diplomat. This is then when his kid gets kidnapped.
I didn't know anything about his wife. That starts to make sense.
She's a famous person. Yeah.
Not only is he a global figure, but now he's starting to actually align
somewhere
with with people of power. That's interesting. I did not know that at all. I never knew anything about his wife.
Yeah. So they then their kid gets kidnapped and murdered 3 years later. It was a huge media circus. There was a ransom that they gave, and they tagged the money, but then the kid never showed up, and then they found the body dead in the woods later.
See, I didn't know that either. I thought that the baby legitimately disappeared. I knew they caught the guy, but I thought they never actually found the body, and that the idea of where did the Lindbergh baby go was still the thought. So I didn't even know that they found
it, and then they got the guy because they found that he was using the money. So they grabbed him and like, where'd you get this money? And then they raided his place and they found all the other money from the ransom. And then he was executed.
Yep, blue bills. We got him.
He's paying with $3 bills over here. But because of all that media circus and the crazy attention and all, his life was in shambles. They moved to Europe. This is where he gets involved with Germany, helps them with aviation, gets these crazy ideas and whatnot, which obviously proliferated. Yeah.
Oh, no.
He actually got a medal from the famous German officer, Erman Goring.
Really?
In 1938. Yeah, like a service medal.
Now it totally makes sense.
Yeah.
See, I didn't know he went to Germany. I didn't know he went to Germany and started helping, honestly, their Air Force. Oh, my God.
Yeah. Then came back to the U.S.
This is a no-brainer.
I'm an
idiot.
Yeah. No,
I had no idea Lindbergh was a Nazi.
Nobody knew. I mean, people knew. So he comes back then in 1939. Like we said, that's literally when the America's First Movement is happening. Yeah. This is when FDR is coming back to get reelected. World War II, we're on the brink. Here's the time and place for him.
What if somebody stood up and said, why is America getting involved? Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's almost an idea of the way history went. You think, oh, well, that was just the thinking of the time. That was the trajectory. That was the clear choice.
Yeah.
It starts to make you actually consider what it would be like to be there and have the political echo swaying on both sides, pushing and pulling and not really knowing who to trust. And what if somebody did stand up, an American hero, a world figure like that, standing up saying, why are we getting involved? I have
one.
Implications of that are massive.
I took one quote from the book, which I thought was great, speaking to what you're talking about, where he's saying, history, where everything unexpected in its own time is chronicled on the page as inevitable. The terror of the unforeseen is what the science of history hides. Because it does just seem like, well, like you said, that's the way it went.
Right, yeah.
And that's the only way it could have gone.
It's so easy to be taught history and go, I see.
Yeah.
That's why I think this time to be studying this show and this thought experiment is perfect, actually. How easy would it be to think and feel that at the time if that's the way it went?
And it's not so far-fetched, I found, and this is in the first episode that you saw. They've only
got 2 out. It comes out on the weekend, so I wasn't able to get to the second episode, but you're not behind. If you don't know anything about this is a perfect time to jump in.
Yeah, no spoilers on anything. They talk from the first episode. This is a real thing. There was a real poll taken in 1939 amongst people in the U.S., and only 39% agreed that Jews should be treated like everyone else. 53% believed that Jews are different and should be restricted, and 10% believed that Jews should be deported.
Oh my God.
That was the public sentiment in the U.S. in 1939.
I definitely thought that was a bit of just writer trying to
No.
understand a little bit of
Yeah.
what how feelings were moving at the time. I
I'll
had no idea
post
that was
I'll post a link.
legitimate
That was a legitimate
poll. That's
poll that was
horrifying.
taken. Yeah. So the reason this whole America's first movement, like we said, well, obviously it disbanded because we got involved in the war. But
Well, I guess we're in it now. They attach us.
yeah, that was December of 1941. Charles Lindbergh, where sort of things really went off the edge, and thank goodness, and like we talked about, like things.
Is this it? Is this when he?
Yeah.
Okay. See, I was wondering when me and Taylor were just kind of comparing lightly notes before the show, and I was like, "Yeah, we had to stop and look into Lindbergh and be like, what he really was." But Taylor found more. Please,
he was giving a speech, doing a rally in September of 41, and I'll post a link to it. There's even audio versions if you want to listen to it.
Oh, wow.
They have it recorded, but he did say. So here's something he said. He was like, "No person with a sense of the dignity of mankind can condone the persecution the Jewish race suffered in Germany."
Okay, check.
All sounds good. But then he goes on to add and talks about how Jews are war agitators and are inciting it. And then the big thing that got him in tons of hot water, he said, "The Jews are one of the principal forces attempting to lead the U.S. into war. The Jews' greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, and our government." Thankfully, there was a lot of press that was like, well, we're pumping the brakes on this because this is, you can't be going around saying that.
See,
what is this movement?
This is the stuff coming out of his mouth in the show, and I'm going, no way.
Yeah, that was
No
a real
way.
speech. Yeah.
It's mind-blowing.
And just as a clarification, he never did run for president.
Yeah.
This is the author's fabrication of like, well, what if we just took it a step?
So he never actually considered it?
There is one sentence in history from some Republican committee members of thinking of asking him or something like that. And that's where Philip Roth gets the idea for this story, because he said he saw that, but there's never any actual, it's very hazy, and there's never actually historical indication. He never made a bid. He never went to the committee.
He never had an
convention.
exploratory committee
Yeah.
to think about running for president.
There was never any of that stuff. And obviously Pearl Harbor happened then, which it doesn't in this fictional account.
That was the equalizer there. You realized exactly what had to happen. And obviously history happened the way it did.
Yeah. So Roosevelt won 4 terms, which is insane.
And wild.
He won the election in 32 after Herbert Hoover had a terrible time with the Depression, Won again in 36. Massive. The other guy, Alf Landon, only won Maine and Vermont. He just destroyed him.
Decimated.
He won again in 40, and then he won again in 44, but died in April of 45, months after starting.
Yeah. Never again.
And that's when Truman, as vice... Yeah, and then they created the 22nd Amendment months later, being like, well, presidents... It was an honorary thing to say you're not going to run 3 terms. Like Roosevelt tried to run and didn't get it.
I don't know. Maybe that's another part of history I'd like to get a little more context of, because it seems really interesting. Looking back now, we look at FDR as such.
He's like one of the greats with Abraham Lincoln, and yeah.
But when you think, it took 4 terms to do that, and then immediately following his death, they were like, never again. Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you just had one of the best presidents of all time that got a lot done, but it took 4 terms, why then would you make a rule saying 2's the max? He got a lot done and saw us through one of the most tumultuous times.
So here's
it's
the
just
thing.
an interesting thought because I've never thought of exactly about, why would somebody want to put that rule in place? That's an area that
that's where we're talking about, like with this America First Committee, where they're like, well, we don't want to go into war. Like Roosevelt had all sorts of problems associated with him as well, which we won't necessarily get into all of them. But just as an example, I'll post a link to a 1936 poll that said, now granted, he's just won his 2nd term. The public answering yes, 45% of them said, "Do you believe the acts and policies of the administration may lead to dictatorship?"
Really?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So the actual 1940 election, since that what was the real thing that happened, if Lindbergh didn't, who was he against all that stuff?
Who did he run against?
It's this guy, Wendell Willkie. Lost to history, it seems like, because we don't know who he is.
Poor guy.
He
Wilkie,
was
old Wilkie.
Very odd, because there were only so many options that, as a Republican, they were willing to put up against Roosevelt in this time.
Yeah.
The other options that they had like too hard of a stance, or they were too isolationist or too pro-war, to balance out what FDR was going for. It was a tenuous time because it's like you don't want to be too far on one side or the other.
Yeah.
This Wendell Willkie guy was not in politics. Very interesting. He was the CEO of the Commonwealth and Southern Corp, which was an electrical power company that provided power to 11 states. So he had nothing to do with politics. He was a businessman.
Interesting.
Going against FDR at this time.
FDR.
He was more pro-war than FDR, which put him on the opposing side, which gave them sort of a balance.
I see.
Because FDR was still in that, whereas people thought, but he's not. He's like waffling, to my understanding.
Yeah.
It's a complicated
He's waiting to
time.
be drawn in.
But this guy is like, no, we need to fight this. We need to send aid to England. And his policies extended over into FDR's time. Like, he is credited with doing a lot of good by promoting those things. Because we did send a ton of aid to Great Britain when it was needed in the form of money and resources and all of that stuff. And he was the proponent of that even into World War II.
So even him just running, he's able to influence the platform.
Yeah.
That had major implications.
Yeah. So in regards to like Lindbergh didn't get the thing, but something that did happen in 1933, there was this guy Smedley Butler. People have such weird names.
We've really changed the name game.
Yeah.
In the last
Wendell
100
Willkie
years.
and Smedley Butler.
We ought to go back, to be honest. I'm tired of Chris. Tired of
John. Get some Smedleys in here.
Get some Wilkies.
This guy, Smedley Butler, he revealed this conspiracy. He was a part of the Marine Corps. He was a big Marine Corps general during World War I.
Yeah.
Wealthy businessmen were trying to create a fascist veterans organization to overthrow FDR in 1933, shortly after his first election.
Oh, wow.
So the precedent for this was there was wartime compensation that was supposed to be doled out to these veterans.
Okay.
But it was such a huge time frame from when they ended the war versus when they were supposed to receive this. So thousands of World War I veterans camped out in D.C. in this protest riotous situation, and Hoover, who was president before FDR, removed them and kicked them out. So then there became this underworld. It's not entirely credible, but this guy said they tried to get him involved in it, and he outed it all.
Oh my!
But it never materialized in anything. But it was definitely the historical fact that something was going on. Whether or not it materialized into an actual coup of these veterans that were just going to storm the White. I mean, who knows what?
That's fascinating stuff. So I'm just trying to imagine what this would have been, would have even been like. It seems almost hokey to have to shoo a bunch of World War I veterans off of the front lawn of the
saying
White
you'll
House.
get your money soon, kind of thing. Yeah.
Good Lord.
So I'd like to discuss some of the other major literary pieces that deal with this alternate history if the U.S. had gone completely fascist, which we have talked about before, whether you know it or not.
Oh,
how about that? So the first one is called "It Can't Happen Here," written in 1935, before any of this is happening.
Oh, wow.
A novel by Sinclair Lewis, who, if you remember, was a part of this America's First Committee much later, whether or not he was anti-Semitic or,
It gets muddy.
He was the first U.S. writer to receive the Nobel Prize.
Really?
Huge body of work.
Wow.
But this novel, It Can't Happen Here, is about the rise of Buzz Windrip, this totalitarian fascist. It's more of a satire, but it's still tragic. But critics say at the time, because obviously all this stuff, World War II wasn't happening yet, it resembles this famous Louisiana politician, Huey Long, who was preparing to run in the 1936 election. Huey Long was assassinated in 1935.
Oh my gosh.
The year this book came out.
Oh my gosh.
But it was treated as, this is a treatise, like, if Huey Long gets in, this is what's going to happen.
I see. Oh, wow.
So it was a totally different alternate history that then never got fulfilled.
Yeah. I mean, because we get caught up in day-to-day of like, what did this person run for president? What did this person run for president? I've never really thought about who were those names being pulled out of a hat in 1936. Like I've never, ever... Like, I barely know who Spiro Agnew is. Nixon's vice president. It's interesting to think about who are the characters and the players in this realm. People who may have never even held an office and actually got anywhere, but their name was in the pile.
Yeah.
And that's interesting enough to understand where the minds of people really were at that time.
Yeah, he's this very controversial governor and then senator from Louisiana,
Mhm.
who was going to be in place of FDR, and then he got assassinated. So,
Lord. How did he
uh,
get assassinated? You know anything about it?
so his assassination, he was just passing a bill removing somebody. This was in the state capitol in Louisiana.
Oh.
The guy who he ousted with the bill's son-in-law came in and shot him with a handgun.
Oh my God.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about that we had talked about before is this book called The Iron Heel,
Mm.
written by Jack London in 1908.
Mm.
And we had talked about Jack London,
Yeah.
London as being like an early proponent of science fiction.
Yeah.
I saw no reference to this, but I pieced the connection together myself. Just listen to this and tell me if it reminds you of anything that we've talked about. It's one of the earliest things classified as modern dystopian fiction. It's unusual for Jack London in that it's a first-person narrative from the perspective of a woman, which he didn't really write from. So the book itself is based on a fictional Everhard manuscript, which was buried and found centuries later from this woman who lived in this crazy dystopian time. The novel has an intro and footnotes by this other scholar who found this manuscript in 2600 AD, which sounds exactly like The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds exactly like The Handmaid's Tale. And what is the basis of
The Iron Heel was
Yeah.
this fascist
Yeah.
crazy government that rose up from 1912 to 1932 in the U.S. as an alternate. But it wasn't. But he was writing this in 1908.
Yeah. No, I mean, but look, he's tapped into something there. He's tapped into the conscious of whatever people are thinking and feeling and whatever is out there in the airwaves at that time.
I just couldn't believe that it was the exact format of like, oh, here's this manuscript found from a woman who had survived this time, and a scholar from 2600 AD is piecing it together what happened in the 1930s.
We repeat ourselves, whether we like it or not. We repeat ourselves.
Sorry if you've heard all this 5 times.
What? No. I mean, humans.
Yeah.
We will continue to repeat this. I mean, even in the most beautiful, crazy of stories, look, the device of that happened. Oh my God. I mean, decades and decades and decades and decades apart.
Yeah.
The exact same device talking about real big injustices and dangers in the world. They're directly relatable, but seemingly have no connection to each other whatsoever. That's just an example of what we were trying to talk about earlier, is that we're moving through history together, and we can only take so much with us. We're getting better at bringing things with us, but we will lose things, and we will repeat ourselves, and we go through this. This is a cycle, a natural cycle throughout the world. This is just another a small example of that, about how it happens even in creativity. I mean, I'm sure we've all made something, and then something else pops up that's just like it. What?
Yeah.
It happens, man. And that means probably more often than not, if that happens to you, you're probably tapped into something. You're probably thinking about something that somebody else really is also thinking about.
Yeah.
That means you're on track somewhere, somehow. So
we're not too far off. There's one little thing which I'll post links to because it's kind of involved and esoteric in a way, but it's by these guys, Howe and Strauss, who came up with the generational theory. Like you're talking about how these things repeat itself over and over and over again.
I just think about all this stuff in 2 a.m. People have actually put names to it all.
These are the guys. You use their work all the time. They coined the term millennials in 1987.
I'm gonna beat them up, giving us that name.
But they were thinking about this stuff long before it's become a concept, and they've written books about like generational cycles from now to 2200 or whatever. They're thinking about how these things repeat. There's some holes in it, but
this stuff is on my mind so much.
Yeah,
and it has been over the last few years. But this type of thing, this is something I'm going to go delve into, because this is really, I'm very, very interested in how we repeat ourselves.
In layman's, it's like there are 4 historical turnings or cycles that happen every 80 to 100 years, 4 that happen, and then there are 4 generational archetypes depending on where you are in your life when those historical moments happen. I won't get into all of it, but that's the general theory of it. And it's just fascinating to look and see how, like, okay, here's how what we call the GI generation, the silent generation, the baby boomers, the millennial generation, Generation X, how they fit into, in general, these are the archetypes of what those generations represent as a type of person, where also that fits 100%. Into the big 4 moments of the past 100 years where you were in your life, and that carries over hundreds of years before us and potentially hundreds of years after us.
Oh God, I love this. This is honestly, I'm trying to bring every episode we do into this realm.
Yeah.
I am so fascinated with this idea of repeating ourselves and how close we come to good things, bad things, and how close we are to just going down different roads, and we just never are aware of that at all. So I'm really thankful that we were able to cover something that directly talks about that idea, because it's really important.
I told Evan before we started, I heard on another podcast, somebody saying the thing about times like these is there's always been times like these.
Yeah.
Like there's something comforting in that, even though it is scary.
Yeah.
And like the season that we haven't thought about for a long time is the one that's most up ahead.
Right.
Because we haven't, like all humans that experienced the flu of 1918 are dead.
They're gone.
So we forgot about it.
Yeah.
But now we're experiencing that again, and
This is a good time to examine things. While we're in the midst of something that almost we didn't think was possible. I'm, for one, am just really thankful that, that we're not having to fight some major conflict, that there's not some major war happening. I'm glad our event is something like this, an equalizer, a unifier globally. That's given me a lot of hope, and it's material like the plot against America in this particular moment that it's really got my wheels turning, and I'm hoping that this is food for thought out there while we're all keeping our distance.
and it's not to be deterministic either. It's like things change, things like you can contribute. It's not just like, well, the wheels of history are turning and it's always going to repeat. There are cycles to these things, but you can be involved in making them what they are.
Yeah. So we'll be here.
Yeah.
We'll be here every Friday.
Yeah. Please reach out to us at illiteratepod on Instagram. We sent out some more stickers to folks because they reached out to us.
I hit up a little lending library down the street. I found a lending library, and I put stickers in a bunch of books, and I left a stack of stickers inside.
Sanitized, of course.
100%.
But if you want some, we will sanitize them before we send them to you. And just reach out to us at illiteratepod on Instagram.
We'd love to hear from you guys.
Okay. Catch you all next week. Bye.